Hello everyone, this is Tom in Los Angeles. I hope you're having a good weekend or a good week whenever and wherever you're watching this video, but thank you for watching. I'm going to talk about Canto 17 of Inferno today. It's a canto that flows very easily, and in my opinion it's a canto to enjoy, to just read by yourself and really enjoy, because it's fairly dynamic and also fairly straightforward compared to other cantos. It's got stunning visual details that impressed me a lot. I remember the first time that I read it, and before starting, I would highlight two particular elements that I think are extraordinary about this Canto 17. The first one is that in depicting usury, the sin of usury, Dante goes well beyond what, in fact, he completely avoids the stereotype of his time that tendentially was anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, and we'll talk about that. So there is already a non-conformative behavior by Dante's in this canto, in that sense. And the second one is just in general, the entire second part of the canto, the flight scene with Geryon, that I consider one of the most beautiful and poetic and magnificent of the entire Inferno. The beast that has the pointed tail, I'm still reading from Pinsky here, that crosses mountains, leaves walls and weapons broken, and makes the stench of which the world is full. Dante and Virgil are now at the edge between circle 7 and 8 of Inferno, which is interesting because we are at the 17th canto out of 34, and we need to remember that there are 9 circles in hell, in Inferno, in the Dante's hell. So there is a spontaneous question that arises here, which is, how is he going to fill the next 17 cantos with only a couple of circles? But he will do. So we'll see exactly how he does that. Geryon is the allegory for fraud, for fraudulent behavior, to the point that Dante actually helps us, finally this time, by saying he is fraud's foul emblem, and came closer, till he had taken his head and chest from the deep to rest on land before us, not drawing his tail onto the bank. We can see that everything that has to do with Geryon's descriptions is it's very, very detailed. To me, it's like the way he writes about Geryon, he must have seen it in a dream, at least, because the details are so realistic for something that is so obviously unrealistic. His head and chest, and he was like a serpent all down his trunk. His face was a just man's face, outwardly kind. We had 2 paws, both hairy to the armpits. It's a monstrous combination of things. Now, Geryon does come from classical myths. In fact, Heracles had fought Geryon in one of his efforts, in his fights, and the monster Geryon was a triple-bodied monster who was, according to a legend, very fraudulent, because he would host people in his house and then wait for them to sleep and then kill them and steal their stuff, their possessions. But Dante doesn't take much out of that Geryon, really, aside from the name, because the body that he's describing here is so different. It probably takes more in terms of visual inspiration from the Bible, because in Revelation there is a serpent or a dragon that is described in a similar way, and Saint Thomas Aquinas quoted this serpent of the Apocalypse by saying that the tail itself was where the fraudulence was residing. So with Geryon, with the monster Geryon, we're looking at his face, which is the perfect normal face of a regular and fair man, kind man. And that's probably the most monstrous aspect of the monster, because his real nature, his real soul or heart, we can say, is in the tail, which at this point he's still keeping a little hidden and suspended in the void behind him, which is already a pretty creepy image to think of. His back and breasts and both sides were painted with designs of knots and circlets. No Tartar or Turk has ever woven a cloth more colored in field and figure, nor were the nets arachnid, etc. So it's a stunning visual here that Dante uses two similes to try and explain to us. He's referring to arabesques and very convoluted woven fabrics that came from the Eastern trade to Florence and to Italy. I believe that in terms of translation, I actually really liked the way that Robbie Kirkpatrick translated this. His back and breast and ribcage were all tattooed with knot designs and spinning little whorls. Maybe it's not precisely what Dante is meaning, but I like this type of translation. In Mark Musa's translation, we have back and belly painted with arabesques and curlicues. So it reminds this type of tapestry and carpets that were coming from Turkey and from the Orient to Italy, to Florence. The second simile is Arachne. He recalls Arachne from Ovid, Metamorphoses, another very common source of images for Dante, as not only, mainly as an example of artistic pride or artistic hubris, let's say, which is very on point here, because that's the general category of sin that the usurers belong to. As a quick recap, who was Arachne in the legend? She was an artist who challenged the goddess Minerva to an artistic type of competition, and the way she was able to weave her work of art with Europa and other elements, they looked so incredibly alive that almost were looking as if they were moving, and there was life in her work of art. So she won the competition, and for revenge or for anger, the goddess transformed her into a spider, and from there Arachne, Arachnide, etc. And she will actually come back, quoted again, recalled again by Dante, I believe, in Purgatory. But it's a great example of a simile here, because of what she represents. She represents somebody who went against God in pride through her art. The way, now another simile, the way beached boats are both on land and partly in water, or the way the beaver squats to battle fish to the death. This is how Geryon is waiting there. Half of his body is on the desert, where Virgil and Dante are, and the rest is suspended in the void. The boat simile is very beautiful, and it's immediately understandable. The beaver simile comes from a bit of a wrong zoology from the Middle Ages, where it was believed that the way beavers would catch the fish was thanks to their oily tail. They would put their oily tail in the water and attract the fish that way, and then turn around and catch the fish in that way. That's what Dante refers to when he says squats to battle fish to the death. In the deep drinking Germans' land. Here is Dante is not being very nice to Germans. but he was also simply, again, we can call it racism today because that's what it sounds like, but it was a way of seeing and also talking about Germans in the Italian peninsula back then as, rather than deep drinking, more as voracious. The word that Dante uses is I tedeschi lurchi. Lurchi from Latin stands more precisely for somebody who is very glutton and eats a lot. The drinking maybe is a secondary aspect of this word, but Pinsky translates with drunk or deep drinking, and Musa and also Kirkpatrick also translate with drunken Germans. And I will be curious to see what other translations do with this tedeschi lurchi. Another very interesting note here, translation note, is that beavers in Dante's version are actually called bivero. Lo bivero s'assetta a far sua guerra. So this is why? Because in Latin, beaver is called biber, and so the root is common, and it sounds almost exactly the same in Latin and in Dante's Italian and in English. However, in modern Italian, it's changed completely. To say beaver in Italian today, you say castoro. One of those curiosities. So the Germans land. So lay the beast upon the edge. His tail was quivery and restless in the void, armed like a scorpion. Now we must incline our path a little. For the second time in Inferno, Dante and Virgil turn to the right. This is another mystery. We didn't know why they turned to the right. The first time was in the circle of heretics, if you remember. This is the second time because they keep going down, circling down L, turning to the left all the time, which is the improper direction if we compare left and right. Somebody says that because of how difficult are the sins of heresy and the sin of fraudulence to overcome, you need to engage your intellect more, and therefore in both cases he reminds us by this concept by turning to the right. But it's absolutely not clear. It's just the second time that he turns to the right, and it's again pretty much of a mystery. 10 steps along the edge to keep well wide. Along the edge they're still repaired from the flames that keep falling on the desert. And at this point Virgil suggests that Dante goes by himself to take a look at the usurers while he talks to Geryon. It's peculiar because it's unique. It's the only time where we see Dante and Virgil really separate in Inferno. What's going on? What's happening? What does it mean? Dante by himself going there. There was a moment just before the city of Dis where they were a little bit distant, but Dante has not really taken any action by himself so far. In this case, he is taking an action by himself. He's going to see the usurers. Probably the reason is that there is something personal for Dante about the usurers in general. And this something personal is the fact that his own family, his father, had been practicing money lending, and he had been making money through money lending. Dante was not born extremely wealthy, but he was wealthy enough with lands to be able to dedicate his life to art, to what he liked, really, to his passions. So there's a personal aspect here, and Virgil just says, please do that, hurry up. He meets then with these usurers. They are presented in a very oddly nightmarish way because there is 3 of them. They're all hunched up like they have been described before, and we need to remember in terms of ethical categories how in Canto 11 Dante had received a lesson from Virgil about the violence against God, divided in direct violence against the person of God, in which is the blasphemers, in violence against nature, which is, we already talked about that, difficult to understand in the specific, but really nature as being the daughter of God, and violence against art. In fact, the usurers commit violence against both nature and art, according to Dante, because they are generating money out of nothing, fundamentally, and the act of creating stuff is only a divine right, and also against art itself, which is the pupil of nature, because they are not generating money with the sweat of their own body, like normally was accepted, but simply on other money. And I have already discussed the topic of usury a few cantos ago, how that is confusing from our point of view, because we need to look into the difference between simple money lending and the request of interest on any type of sum amount or any type of percentage of interest, and the actual usury. Back in the Middle Ages, in general, usury and money lending was a little bit blurred. It was more or less the same, because this is what was gathered from the Bible. And today that concept has completely changed. We look at usury in a different way, only when there is an element of excess in the rates. But you know, I'm not going to delve more into this. It's what's interesting is how Dante presents these particular usurers. They are hunched up. They have a lot of, they're in pain, of course, and they're moving to like dogs, like beasts. He describes really their beastly behavior, and it's not a coincidence that he places them really close to the edge with the abyss of fraudulence. They are really close there. Maybe these more than others, because if you remember, we've seen some more usurers a little bit earlier in this desert. So Dante's treatment of usury is culturally non-normative, a little bit like his treatment of sodomy. His treatment of usury is culturally non-normative in the sense that he avoided stereotyping and stigmatizing the Jews as moneylenders. This is something that was very common in his times. If we think about iconography or other literary works around his time, in images, I'm gonna maybe show one or two of these paintings of the time. The Jewish people were often represented with this little purse or money bag around their neck, and there was a very strong note of anti-Semitism in this type of representations. Again, he goes beyond this type of attitude and avoids stereotyping people, which is something that is personal. It's a personal choice on Dante's part. On this point, in fact, I've read a great essay by a prominent Dantista. Her name is Teodolinda Barolini, who talks about Dante's sympathy for the other, Dante's particular sensitivity and openness towards somebody who had some type of difference, which was culturally non-normative for his times. This is a great essay. Maybe I'm gonna try and find it and link it to my video. She talks about the non-stereotyping imagination of Dante, not only in the sense of the usurers, but as we've talked about before, homosexuals and anybody who, which is a very modern type of sensitivity. If we think about our days today, we are at levels of sensitivity for differences and the other that have never been as they are before in history. But when we talk about Dante as somebody who was prophetic in a certain sense and really modern, this is a great example of that concept. So Dante describes this three usurers. Again, in this static position, they are trying to take away the pain by moving like beasts, like dogs. And each of them has this money bag around their neck with their heraldic crests, on their family heraldic crests on their money bags, which is clearly a follow-up on his critique of Florence that he did in the previous canto, where Florence, but not only, wider than Florence, because he takes in consideration Padua and other towns where usurers were in those times. And the concept of having these crests on the money bags is fundamentally, look, all the nobility of your family is almost identified now with your money, with the money that you're making with this type of activity. And finally, with another beast-like behavior, they stick out one of them sticks out his tongue at Dante like an ox, and that's it. He liquidates the usurers like that. Now, the level of fear that Dante expresses here when it comes to go back and do the next step, plunging into the abyss of fraudulence, which we'll see later is called malebolge, is described in a very strong way, in a way that Dante has not described in this way before, because he compares it to somebody who's shaking, feeling the quartan fever coming on. There was a type of fever that came in his days, and it was really, really strong, that left people's nails blue so that they shiver at the mere sight of shade. Such I was then. That's the level of fear that he's feeling now. But shame rebuked me, which makes a servant braver in a good master's presence. So now we have Virgil as master, in a masterly figure, and also in a fatherly position in this second part of the canto. His two strong arms around me to steady me as soon as I had mounted up, commanding, Geryon, move ahead, but carefully, and keep your arcs wide. Go slowly when descending. Now here is the beginning of what to me is one of my favorite scenes of the entire Inferno. It's visually awesome, outstanding, and it's shocking. It's shocking for a medieval poet. How strong his imagination must have been to imagine the details, the visual details of flying in the night, and how that would feel, and how that would, not only visually, but physically as well. Every single line is an outstanding detail. So slowly did Geryon withdraw from shore. First he compares it to a boat. Then when he felt himself quite free, he turned and brought his tail to where his foreparts were. The way a swimming eel does, very naturalistic similes throughout the whole canto. A couple of classical similes here. He brings up the name of Phaeton and the name of Icarus. Phaeton was a semigod, a demigod, son of Apollo, son of the sun, and because of dare almost, they told him, you are not Apollo's son, but he wanted to prove it, and if Apollo would lend him his chariot of the sun, then that would prove that he was actually his son, his father. Apollo did allow him to ride his chariot, and it was a disaster. The sun was going everywhere, the horses didn't recognize the master, and at the end Jupiter had to intervene by striking poor Phaeton with a thunderbolt and just killing him there. Problem solved. Is an example of a failed or a doomed flyer, which, as we all know, Icarus is another perfect example. Now both of them, Icarus and Phaeton, are also quoted here because they are almost lightweight examples of what Ulysses, in a few cantos as we go on in Inferno, will represent. Ulysses is in Inferno is the quintessential transgressor. Icarus and Phaeton, both of them transgressed, and they go against God in a certain sense, existentially, because they sin of pride and hubris. But they are almost the anticipation of how strongly and how much more Ulysses will commit the same sin. The Pinsky translation is actually saying here about Daedalus, Icarus's father, his father crying, "You are falling now." However, the sentence that Dante says here is "mala via tieni," which is a way to render Ovid's story of Icarus, giving it a morality edge. Mala via tieni means you are going the wrong way, instead of you are falling now. And I'm curious also to see what other translations are saying. He tinges the dialogue from Daedalus of morality. Instead of, while in Ovid it was simply, "Icarus, where are you? In what region should I seek you?" But you're on the wrong path, which is very important given that the entire Divine Comedy is about a metaphorical path. So the rest of the scene is just pure beauty. The way he looks down from Geryon's body, the way the dark ground first is invisible and then it becomes gradually visible because he realizes that he's getting closer, is just something to be enjoyed, maybe with some music in the background, like I'm probably gonna do in 5 minutes. And finally, he vanished, Geryon, like an arrow from the string. Thanks again, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this 17th canto. We're gonna talk again for canto 18.